Hello and welcome back to Raw 1251 AM, your student radio station. And I'm delighted to be joined by Amir Amirani, who is the director and producer of We Are Many, which is a film that was broadcasted for our protest and performance week at Warwick University. Firstly, Amir, what sort of drove you to, for you to be the one to make this film?
Thank you. What drove me to make the film was that I was in Berlin in 2003, at the film festival to make a short film, and I knew that the demonstration against the Iraq war was in the air, and there was no doubt in my mind that I was going to go on it, and the question for me was whether I would go in Berlin or in London, where I live. And I decided to stay in Berlin, and looking back on it now, I realize it was my first demonstration, though not my first political act. And when I got back to London and I was told how big it was, 2 million in London, I felt I'd missed out on something quite important. And that got me thinking that if it was so big in London and it was huge in Berlin, it was 500,000, where else did it happen? And then I started to look into it and realized it was global, realized that it was probably the biggest protest in history. And that's when I thought that this was a potentially really interesting story to tell of a historic moment which most people at the time thought was a failure to stop the Iraq war, and even a story that might be regarded as a failure can still be a compelling story. So that was really the genesis of the story for me and how I decided to make the film.
So you've got your political views and your sort of strong inkling to want to make this film. Then comes the practical problems. I mean, the film budget was for a documentary, it was a reasonable amount, but, how did you sort of afford to where did you start? How did you think you were going to afford to make this film?
Well, it's a good question. Previously, I had made documentaries for the BBC and Channel 4, largely the BBC. They were fully commissioned. I produced and directed them with a budget provided. This time I had to find the budget. I didn't know what it was going to cost. I didn't know where the money was going to come from. I tried the BBC and Channel 4 to get them interested at the beginning. They were not interested. I ended up in 2011 launching a Kickstarter campaign, crowdfunding campaign. I should say, though, that I had actually begun work on the film in 2006. Between 2006 and 2011, I was researching and developing the story, really digging into it to find out all the characters and how the story of the demonstration evolved. During that period, I had very little income, and I had to remortgage my flat in London 3 times just to be able to pay my bills. But in 2011, I did a Kickstarter campaign. We were successful. We raised $92,000, and in 2012, I began work with that amount. And over the last 5 years, I raised roughly £600,000 to make the film. But the real cost of the film is probably well over $1 million, because I did many deals to cut our costs, but you can only cut your costs to a certain extent. So the hard costs are about 600,000, and probably the real costs are, as I said, well over $1 million. So I ended up filming in 7 countries around the world, interviewed over 100 people. We had about 200 hours of interview footage, and I had about 200 hours of archive footage as well that I had to whittle down to 110 minutes. So it took a long time. I think it was 9 years in the making. But some stories, some films do take that amount of time and actually are the better for it, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say, editing a film like that, and sort of, obviously, in total it's about 10 years really worth of footage, and then that long day that it was obviously historical, editing that must have been actually a really difficult process for you, thinking what's going to go in and what's, not going to go in.
Yes, it took a lot of time to actually, as I say, it took about 4 or 5 years to sort of work out the arc of the story. But then when you start to make the film, and you shoot, and then you get into the editing into the cutting room, then you have to craft the film all over again with what you have. And I think on and off, we edited for about 2 years. A bit of start-stop with funding and so on. But I would say it was about 2 years. And, you have to sort of, grapple with the material, read all the interviews, and in the end, you're polishing and polishing and polishing until you have a sort of a story that works, that flows.
You mentioned there about having about 100 hours of interview footage. How difficult was it acquiring those interviews? So I know you couldn't get the full cabinet to participate in an interview in Tony Blair. So how difficult was it, and who did you sort of think to approach and whatnot in regards to interviewing?
The main criteria I had was that everyone had to have something to do with that demonstration. They either had to have been on it as a member of the public, or as an artist, as an activist, an organizer, or indeed as a politician, to have been in a position where they had to act upon their thoughts and feelings about the demonstration. So the demonstration of that day, 15th of February 2003, was the connecting detail. And so that then made it easy. So on the one hand, it was the activists, and then I wanted to find other people from a broad spectrum of, sort of artists and others and other commentators, journalists and so on, who had something to say about that demonstration. The majority of people, once I reached them, were keen to be interviewed. The politicians, as you said, Tony Blair's cabinet largely didn't. I think I got 2 people talk. Tony Blair, of course, didn't talk. But on the whole, people had never really been asked about that demonstration. And I think they were keen to talk. So, the broadcasters, the mainstream media, newspapers and so on, hadn't really seen that day as significant. But for me, that was really a big story. And so some people were hard to reach because they have gatekeepers, but once I got to them, they wanted to talk.
And in terms of sort of other projects that are out there that perhaps aren't as high profile, how did you find yourself liaising with anyone? So I know George Galloway has a controversial film out about Tony Blair as well. And I was wondering, did you sort of feel that you were overlapping with other projects, or did you sort of merge with other projects, or did you want to keep a distance?
There were no other projects about the demonstration. There was a small one that was made that wasn't really, for me, as significant. It was sort of just about the UK, about the London protest, and I know the people, and that was really not a competition. There was no other film of this scale about the demonstration. I had worried about it, but in the end, my worries were unfounded. I became aware of the George Galloway film about Tony Blair. I think that's the one you're talking about. A few years ago, they came to me and asked my advice. But again, that was not a direct competition or threat to my film. And I gave them what little advice I could, but it was a totally different sort of subject in a way to the subject of my film about that particular day. So there was really, on the whole, no issue about overlapping with anything else.
And just sort of final few thoughts. Firstly, on the Chilcot Inquiry, you had a question about this in the screening. Do you hold much hope for what that will entail? And do you think, it's been delayed for so long now, and you spoke about Maxwellization, I think it's called. Do you think it will be delayed even further? And do you think it will even be of any sort of substance or even relevance to the cause?
They say that the Chilcot report is going to be published in June or July, having been, is it 5 or 6 years now? Or maybe 7 years. I don't hold out much hope. From the beginning, it's had no teeth. It's had no lawyers on it. Its findings are not and will not be binding. And if it does come out in June or July, I think it will be largely a whitewash. It's been discredited. Now, I may be being hard on it, but they haven't done themselves any favors by the delays. I think that Tony Blair's apparent apology that he made last year was actually in response, in my view, to having seen the contents of the Chilcot Inquiry with regard to himself. And I think that's an indication of really the extent of what is going to be said about him, which is not a great deal. So I think we're going to be, I don't think anyone should be holding their breath. Chilcot at the very beginning said this is going to be a lessons learned inquiry. And he gave most of the people a very, very easy ride. The whole panel gave them a very easy ride. So unless he's really changed tack, I doubt it. I doubt very much that they're going to have anything really interesting and significant to say.
And just finally, what did that day do to politics in your eyes? So obviously, when you watch the film, Jeremy Corbyn features a lot in it, and obviously he's now leader of the Labour Party within a serious shot of becoming Prime Minister. And you spoke about Bernie Sanders in the US. Do you think that day really did alter sort of the core of politics?
You know, we're only, 13 years on from that demonstrations, and arguably it's a bit too soon to say. When I started to make the film in 2006, at that point people said to me, "You're too late." Only 3 years after the demonstration, and we released it last year, and we're still living with the consequences. We're seeing the consequences of the demonstration and of the war. I think the result of that demonstration can be seen in two significant ways. One is that a lot of young people, a lot of first-timers came on the demonstration and got their first taste of politics and became politicized and perhaps, radicalized in some way. A lot of people lost their faith in the political system on that day, maybe an older generation, and the sort of scales fell from their eyes. People who had a real faith in politics and in democracy and the idea that people's voices mattered, their voices mattered, that a demonstration on that scale would mean something, lost their faith. And on the other hand, some other people were more sanguine about it and thought, well, okay, we sort of knew this, now it's been demonstrated, we must find and think about other ways to make our voices heard. One of those was David Babbs, who went on to found 38 Degrees, the online petitioning platform. And other people went on to get involved in direct action and other kinds of, protests. So it was a significant moment, and I suspect we will probably much further down the line look back and draw even more interesting conclusions about that demonstration. But I really think it was a real turning point, not just for British politics but for international politics, because people saw in a very clear, unambiguous way that despite huge historic opposition to a war, the decision to go to war, as we now know, was taken in advance of that in an incredibly undemocratic way. And that's a lesson that's not easily forgotten.
Thank you so much for joining us.